In the small, sleepy town of Cedarwood, nestled deep in the heart of America, secrets lay hidden behind closed doors. Mark Evans was a man who appeared to have everything: a loving wife, Alexandra, 2 beautiful children, and a successful career as a real estate agent. Their marriage was the envy of many, built on what seemed to be a solid foundation of trust and companionship. Mark was the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries, brought home flowers without a reason, and always made sure to tuck the kids in at night. But beneath his polished exterior was a secret he carried like a weight chained to his heart. Mark was having a secret affair with his brother-in-law, Daniel. It all started innocently, with lingering looks and light-hearted jokes that quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. Drawn to Daniel's wild and unpredictable nature, which contrasted with his own controlled and cautious demeanor, Mark found himself making excuses to visit Daniel's apartment late at night, seeking refuge from life's pressures. These visits soon turned physical, as their secret relationship grew more intense and thrilling with each encounter. Despite the guilt weighing heavily on them, they couldn't resist the strong pull between them, leading to a risky and passionate affair that neither could walk away from. At first, it was just conversations, long, deep talks that seemed to fill a void Mark hadn't realized existed within him. Daniel had a way of understanding him, of seeing right through the layers Mark had spent years building up. There was something magnetic about him, something Mark couldn't resist, and before long, their encounters escalated into something physical. The guilt gnawed at Mark like a relentless beast, but the thrill of the affair was intoxicating. The secret meetings, the stolen kisses, the hurried moments of passion when no one else was around. It was a rush unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. But the story doesn't end there. Mark tried to keep his emotions in check, to keep the affair purely physical, but the heart is a stubborn thing. He found himself thinking about Daniel at all hours of the day, obsessing over when they would be able to see each other again. It was no longer just an affair, it was something deeper, something that terrified Mark to his core. Meanwhile, Alexandra remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal brewing within her own family. She loved her husband deeply and trusted him implicitly. She was close to her brother too, and was always glad when Mark seemed to be making an effort to bond with him. In her eyes, everything was perfect. But perfection is often a fragile illusion, and it only takes the smallest of cracks for it to shatter completely. As the affair deepened, so did Mark's obsession. What had once been a thrilling escape from his mundane life became an all-consuming need. He started to grow paranoid, fearing that someone would discover their secret. The slightest hint of suspicion from Alexandra or anyone else sent him spiraling into anxiety. He knew that if the truth ever came out, it would destroy everything: his marriage, his career, his reputation. But the more he tried to end it, the more entangled he became. He couldn't let go of Daniel, no matter how much he wanted to. Daniel, on the other hand, was far less concerned about the consequences. He had always lived life on his own terms and wasn't about to let something like this affair change that. To him, it was just another adventure, another thrill to add to his list. He cared for Mark, sure, but he wasn't about to let it take over his life. He had other lovers and other distractions, and he didn't see why Mark couldn't just relax and enjoy the ride. But this cavalier attitude only served to fuel Mark's obsession. He needed Daniel to need him just as much as he needed Daniel, and the fact that he didn't drove him mad. Things came to a head one summer night, when the heat of the day had given way to a cool, breezy evening. The family had gathered at Alexandra and Mark's house for a barbecue, the kind of casual get-together they often had during the warmer months. Mark had been on edge all day, barely able to focus on the conversations happening around him. Every time Daniel looked his way, Mark's heart raced, but it wasn't with excitement anymore. It was with fear. Fear that someone would notice. Fear that someone would see the way he looked at Daniel and put the pieces together. But Daniel, as always, seemed completely at ease. He laughed and joked with the other guests, making everyone around him feel comfortable. Mark envied him for the way he could just switch off his emotions and act like nothing was wrong. But it also enraged him. He wanted to shake Daniel, to make him understand how much was at stake. As the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Mark found himself alone with Daniel in the backyard. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Mark's hands trembled as he reached for his drink, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. He wanted to end it, to tell Daniel that they couldn't see each other anymore, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there staring at the man who had come to mean everything to him and nothing at all. Sensing the shift in Mark's demeanor, Daniel finally spoke. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Everything okay?" "Okay." Mark nodded, though it was far from the truth. "Just tired," he lied. "It's been a long day." Daniel didn't buy it, and Mark knew it, but he didn't push. He just gave Mark that same easy smile, the one that had first drawn him in, and leaned back against the fence. "Maybe you just need a break," he said, his tone light. "We can take some time apart if you want." The suggestion hit Mark like a punch to the gut. The thought of being away from Daniel, of not being able to see him, was unbearable. But he also knew that continuing down this path would only lead to more pain and destruction. He was trapped, caught between his desire and his fear, with no way out. And so, the night ended as so many others had, without resolution, without closure. Mark watched as Daniel walked away, feeling more alone than ever. In the days that followed, Daniel's absence was a constant ache, a wound that refused to heal. Mark tried to immerse himself in his work and in his family, but nothing could fill the emptiness that Daniel's rejection had left behind. Alexandra began to notice the changes in her husband. Mark, once so attentive and engaged, had become distant and withdrawn. He barely spoke at the dinner table, his mind always somewhere else. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights, and the spark that once brightened his gaze was gone, replaced by a hollow stare that chilled her to the bone. She couldn't understand what was happening to him, and each time she asked, Mark brushed her concerns aside with a forced smile and a mumbled excuse. Alexandra wasn't naive. She knew something was wrong, something deeper than the stress of work or the pressures of life. She noticed the way Mark would stiffen when Daniel's name was mentioned, and how he would leave the room whenever Daniel's visits were brought up in conversation. But every time she tried to get him to open up, he would shut down, retreating further into himself. The tension in the house became unbearable, a suffocating presence that lingered in every corner. Alexandra found herself tiptoeing around her husband, afraid that the wrong word or gesture might set him off. She missed the man she had married, the man who had always been her rock, her confidant. And as the days turned into weeks, she began to wonder if she had lost him for good. Mark's obsession with Daniel had only grown more intense since their last conversation. The more Daniel pulled away, the more desperate Mark became to hold on to him. He spent hours each day replaying their encounters in his mind, analyzing every word, every look, searching for some sign that Daniel still cared, that he hadn't meant what he said. But the more he thought about it, the more paranoid he became. What if Daniel had found someone else? What if he was already moving on, leaving Mark behind like a discarded toy? The thought was unbearable. Mark needed to see Daniel, to talk to him, to make him understand that they were meant to be together. But every time he reached out, Daniel was cold and distant, brushing him off with vague excuses and promises to talk later. It drove Mark to the brink of madness, the uncertainty eating away at him until he could barely function. Then, one night, Mark reached his breaking point. It was late, the house silent as Alexandra and the kids slept upstairs. Mark sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty glass in his hand, his mind racing. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that he could just move on and forget about Daniel. He needed answers, closure, something to make sense of the chaos his life had become. Without thinking, Mark grabbed his keys and headed out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He drove through the deserted streets, the town's familiar landmarks passing by in a blur as his mind fixated on one destination, Daniel's apartment. When Mark arrived, he hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the car door and stepping into the cool night air. He stood outside Daniel's building, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to summon the courage to go inside. He knew this was a bad idea, that he should turn around and go home, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed to see Daniel. He needed to hear from him once and for all. Mark made his way to Daniel's door, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He hesitated again, his hand hovering over the doorbell, but the thought of turning back now was unbearable. He pressed the button and waited, his heart pounding in his ears. It felt like an eternity before the door finally opened, and there stood Daniel, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of Mark standing on his doorstep. "Mark," Daniel said, his voice laced with surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He stared at Daniel, his emotions a whirlwind of fear, desperation, and anger. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all he could manage was a choked whisper. "We need to talk." Daniel sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if contemplating whether to let Mark in. After a moment, he stepped aside and gestured for Mark to enter. "Fine, but make it quick." The apartment was dimly lit, a few scattered lamps casting long shadows across the floor. Mark could see that Daniel had been in the middle of something. Papers were spread out on the coffee table, and a half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter. It all seemed so ordinary, so normal, and yet it felt like stepping into a different world, one where Mark no longer belonged. They sat down, facing each other across the coffee table, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Mark's mind raced with all the things he wanted to say, all the questions he wanted to ask, but now that he was here, the words refused to come. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence. "Mark, this has to stop," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've been patient, but you can't keep doing this. You need to move on." Mark's heart shattered at the words. "Move on? How can you say that after everything we've been through?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mark, I never wanted this to go this far. It was supposed to be fun and escape for both of us, but it's over. You have to accept that." The finality in Daniel's tone hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had come here hoping for answers, for something to hold on to, but all he found was a door being slammed in his face. The anger and hurt that had been simmering inside him for weeks suddenly boiled over, and before he knew what he was doing, he was on his feet, his voice rising in a shout. "You can't do this to me, Daniel. You can't just walk away like it meant nothing." Daniel stood as well, his voice growing sharp with frustration. "It didn't mean nothing, Mark, but it wasn't supposed to be forever. You have a family, a wife who loves you. You need to go back to them and let this go." But Mark couldn't let it go. He couldn't let Daniel walk away, not again, not after everything. His hands shook with rage as he advanced on Daniel, his voice trembling. "You don't get to decide when this ends, Daniel. You don't get to just." "Mark, stop." Daniel's voice was firm, his eyes hard. "This is over. You need to leave." Something in Mark snapped. All the pain, the fear, the desperation that had been building inside him for weeks exploded, and before he knew what he was doing, he grabbed Daniel by the shoulders, shaking him. "You don't get to do this to me." The moment hung in the air, tense and fragile, and in that split second, Mark saw something in Daniel's eyes: fear. It was like a bucket of cold water dumped over him, shocking him back to reality. He released Daniel, stumbling back as the horror of what he had almost done washed over him, but the damage was already done. The look in Daniel's eyes told Mark that things would never be the same. Daniel took a step back, his expression unreadable. "You need help, Mark, please, just go home." Mark stood there, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of his actions sank in. He had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and in that moment he realized that he had lost everything: his brother-in-law, his secret lover, and any chance of holding on to the life he had so desperately tried to protect. Mark turned and fled the apartment, the door slamming shut behind him. He ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in his ears as he tried to escape the overwhelming tide of emotions threatening to drown him. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, where he collapsed against the steering wheel, sobs racking his body as the weight of his obsession came crashing down on him. As Mark sat there, broken and alone, he knew that he couldn't go on like this. Something had to give, something had to change, because he couldn't live with the torment of loving Daniel, knowing that Daniel would never love him back. After that night at Daniel's apartment, everything spiraled out of control. Mark couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in his chest. His every thought was consumed by Daniel, by the bitter reality that the man he loved had walked away without looking back. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At work, his colleagues whispered behind his back, wondering what had happened to the man they once knew. He missed appointments, forgot important meetings, and made careless mistakes that cost him clients. His boss, usually lenient, began to lose patience, but Mark was too far gone to notice or care. All that mattered was the crushing sense of loss and betrayal that haunted him day and night. At home, things were even worse. Alexandra, who had always been the anchor that kept Mark grounded, now seemed like a stranger. Mark avoided her as much as possible, the guilt and shame of his affair with Daniel making it impossible for him to even look her in the eye. When they did speak, it was tense, clipped, and full of awkward silences that neither of them knew how to break. One evening, after yet another argument that ended with Mark storming out of the house, Alexandra finally reached her breaking point. She cornered him in the kitchen, her eyes red from crying, and demanded to know what was going on. "Mark, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "I can't take this anymore. You've been distant, cold. You're not the man I married. What happened to us?" Mark stared at her. He wanted to tell her the truth, to unload the unbearable weight he'd been carrying for so long. But how could he? How could he destroy her with the knowledge that he had betrayed her in the worst possible way with her brother? Instead of confessing, Mark lashed out, his voice sharp and cutting. "Nothing happened. Why do you always have to make everything about you? Maybe I'm just tired, okay? Maybe I just need some space." The look of hurt and confusion on Alexandra's face was like a knife to his heart, but Mark couldn't stop himself. The words kept spilling out, cruel and venomous, as if by hurting her, he could somehow ease the pain inside himself. But all it did was make things worse. Alexandra's voice, barely above a whisper, asked the question Mark had been dreading. "Is there someone else?" Mark's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing. He wanted to deny it, to lie and tell her she was imagining things, but the guilt was too much. The weight of his secrets was too heavy. Instead, he turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "Mark, please," Alexandra continued, her voice breaking. "I just want to know the truth. I deserve that much, don't I?" But Mark couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to shatter her world the way his had been shattered, so he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, while Alexandra's sobs filled the room. And when she finally left, retreating to their bedroom and slamming the door behind her, Mark felt something inside him break. The days that followed were a blur of misery and regret. Mark couldn't escape the crushing weight of what he had done, the knowledge that he had destroyed his marriage, his family, and his life. He tried to reach out to Daniel one last time, desperate for some kind of closure, but Daniel didn't respond. He was gone, and with him went any hope Mark had of finding peace. The final straw came one night when Mark received a phone call that would change everything. It was late, and Mark was sitting alone in the darkened living room, nursing a drink and trying to drown out the thoughts that wouldn't leave him alone. The phone rang, startling him, and he fumbled to answer it, his heart pounding. Mark, the voice on the other end, was familiar but strained. It was Daniel's. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Why are you calling?" There was a long pause, and then Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see you. Now." Mark's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding his brain. Why now? Why after all this time? But he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, his heart racing as he drove through the quiet streets towards Daniel's apartment. When he arrived, Daniel was waiting for him at the door, his face pale and drawn. Mark could see the fear in his eyes and the tension in his posture. Something was wrong, and it sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Daniel, what's going on?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. Daniel didn't answer right away. He motioned for Mark to follow him inside, and as soon as the door closed behind them, he turned to face Mark, his expression a mixture of desperation and Mason. "I've made a terrible mistake," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "I thought I could handle this, but I can't. I need your help." Mark's heart sank. "What are you talking about? What happened?" Daniel hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. It's about Alexandra. She found out about us. I didn't mean for it to happen, but she did." Mark felt the floor drop out from under him. "Alexandra knows." Daniel nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "She confronted me. She was furious, Mark. I tried to explain, but she didn't take it well." Mark's mind was reeling, his thoughts racing a mile a minute. If Alexandra knew, then everything was over. His marriage, his life, it was all about to come crashing down. But before he could fully process the gravity of the situation, Daniel spoke again. "Mark," she threatened to tell everyone. Daniel whispered, his voice filled with dread. "She said she was going to ruin us both." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he took in Daniel's words. The implications were staggering. If Alexandra went public with what she knew, it would destroy not only their families but their entire lives. Mark would lose everything, and the scandal would follow them both forever. Daniel took a step closer, his voice low and urgent. "Mark, we have to stop her. We can't let her do this." The room seemed to close in around Mark as the full weight of what Daniel was suggesting hit him. "Stop her? What are you saying?" Daniel's eyes locked onto Mark's, a dark intensity burning in them. "I'm saying that we can't let her ruin us. We need to do whatever it takes to keep her quiet." Mark felt his blood turn to ice. "You're not suggesting." "I don't want to," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "But what choice do we have? If she tells anyone, our lives are over." Mark stumbled back, his mind spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How had it come to this? How had their affair led them to the brink of something so unthinkable? But as he looked into Daniel's eyes, he saw the desperation there, the fear that mirrored his own. Mark knew that Daniel was right. If Alexandra went public, it would destroy everything. The thought of losing his children, his life, his future, it was too much to bear. But the alternative was something he couldn't even fathom. As the gravity of the situation settled in, Mark realized that he was standing at a crossroads. One path led to destruction, the other to something far darker, something that would change him forever. And in that moment, Mark made a decision, one that would set off a chain of events from which there would be no turning back. The two men sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice hollow. "What do we do?" Daniel looked at him, a grim determination in his eyes. "We make sure she doesn't talk. Ever." And with that, the die was cast. As Mark and Daniel put their plan into motion, the full horror of what they were about to do began to sink in. There was no turning back now, no second guessing. They were committed, bound together by the dark secret. They shared a secret that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The night was eerily quiet as they made their way to Mark's house, where Alexandra was likely asleep, unaware of the fate that awaited her. Mark's hands shook as he unlocked the door, his mind numb with fear and disbelief. He had never imagined his life would come to this, a twisted nightmare from which there was no waking. As they entered the house, the weight of what they were about to do bore down on Mark like a suffocating blanket. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow. This wasn't him. This wasn't the man he was meant to be, but it was too late to turn back. The choices he had made, The obsession that had consumed him had led him to this moment. And then everything happened so quickly. Alexandra awoke as they entered the bedroom, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the two men standing there, the darkness of the night framing them like specters from a terrible dream. For a moment there was only silence, heavy, oppressive silence that weighed on the room like a shroud. And then reality came crashing in. "Mark, what's going on?" Her voice was shaky, laced with confusion and fear. She could sense that something was wrong. Mark froze, his mind racing but unable to form coherent thoughts. He could see the fear in Alexandra's eyes and the way she clutched the sheets to her chest, as if they could somehow protect her from what was about to happen. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to run, to take back what he had set in motion. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by his own choices. Daniel, however, wasn't paralyzed. With a cold determination that sent chills down Mark's spine, he stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "Alexandra, you need to listen to me. This doesn't have to get ugly. Just don't say anything. Don't tell anyone." Alexandra's eyes darted between the two men, confusion turning to horror as she realized what they were suggesting. You're trying to silence me?" "Daniel, how could you?" "Mark, please, we can work this out. We don't have to do this." But Mark knew it was too late. There was no working it out, no going back. They had crossed a line, and now they were standing on the precipice of something unforgivable. The fear in Alexandra's voice tore at Mark's heart, but the darkness that had taken hold of him was too strong, too overwhelming. Daniel's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he spoke with an edge that left no room for doubt. "Alexandra, just keep quiet. If you do, we can all move on from this. But if you don't," his voice trailed off, leaving the threat hanging in the air like a guillotine. Alexandra's fear turned to anger. "You think you can threaten me into silence? I won't let you destroy everything, Daniel. I won't let you ruin Mark's life any more than you already have." Daniel's expression hardened, and Mark saw the shift in his eyes, the moment when desperation turned into something darker, something dangerous. Without another word, Daniel lunged forward, his hands reaching for Alexandra with a force that took her by surprise. She fought back, struggling against him, but Daniel was stronger, driven by a determination that bordered on madness. Mark watched in horror as the scene unfolded before him, unable to move, unable to think. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: love, guilt, fear, and something even darker, something primal that he didn't want to acknowledge. He had wanted to stop this, to take back control, but the moment had passed, and now he was nothing more than a spectator to the destruction he had set in motion. Alexandra's screams filled the room, desperate and panicked, as she fought to free herself from Daniel's grasp. She looked at Mark, her eyes pleading, begging him to intervene to stop this madness before it was too late. But Mark couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body betraying him, as his mind screamed for him to do something, anything. In a moment of sheer desperation, Alexandra broke free from Daniel's grip. She scrambled away, reaching for the bedside lamp, and swung it wildly at Daniel. The lamp connected with a sickening thud, and Daniel staggered back, clutching his head in pain. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like Alexandra might escape, that she might survive this nightmare. But Daniel, enraged and fueled by pain, lunged at Alexandra again, this time with even more force. The two of them collided, crashing into the nightstand and sending objects scattering across the floor. Mark stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat as he watched the struggle unfold. His mind couldn't process the horror of what was happening. And then, with a sudden, sickening sound, everything stopped. Mark blinked, his vision blurring as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Alexandra lay on the floor, her body motionless, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Blood pooled around her head, spreading across the hardwood floor like a dark, spreading stain. Daniel stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands shaking, covered in blood. The room was eerily silent. The only sound was the ragged breaths of the two men as they stared down at the lifeless body between them. Mark's mind raced, a torrent of thoughts and emotions crashing over him, threatening to drown him in a sea of despair. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Mark fell to his knees beside Alexandra, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her, to feel for any sign of life. But there was nothing. She was gone. The woman he had once loved, the mother of his children, the person who had been his anchor in the storm, was gone. And it was his fault. All of it was his fault. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with the realization of what he had done. "Mark, I didn't mean to. It just happened." But Mark couldn't hear him. The world had collapsed around him. His life was reduced to rubble in an instant. All he could see was Alexandra's lifeless body. All he could hear was the silence that followed her last breath. And in that moment, something inside Mark broke. The reality of what they had done settled in, and Mark felt a darkness take hold of him, a cold, numbing emptiness that spread through his veins like poison. He looked up at Daniel, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "What have we done?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. No answer could make sense of the horror they had unleashed. No justification could erase the blood on their hands. With a numb, mechanical precision, the two men set about covering their tracks. They cleaned the blood, removed any trace of the struggle, and staged the scene to look like an accident. Mark moved through the motions as if in a trance, his mind disconnected from the reality of what he was doing. But even as he worked, the enormity of what they had done weighed on him, crushing him under its unbearable weight. When it was over, they stood in the silence of the bedroom, their breathing heavy, their hearts pounding. The house was dark and still. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street outside. Mark looked at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. In a few hours, the world would wake up, and they would have to face the consequences of their actions. As Mark and Daniel left the house, stepping into the cold pre-dawn air, Mark's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. They had gotten away with it for now, but how long could they keep up the charade? How long before the truth came crashing down around them, and what would become of them when it did? But most of all, Mark wondered if he would ever be able to live with what he had done. The weight of his guilt, his obsession, and his betrayal was too much to bear, and he knew that no matter how far he ran, he could never escape the darkness that had consumed him. And so, the story comes to an end. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark Evans walked away from the life he had known, forever changed by the choices he had made and the blood on his hands that would never wash away. In the days that followed, the weight of their actions pressed down on Mark and Daniel like a suffocating fog. The carefully staged accident gave them a temporary reprieve, but the reality of what they had done lingered in every corner of their lives. Mark returned to his house, to the facade of normalcy, but the silence in the home was deafening without Alexandra's presence. The town was in shock at Alexandra's sudden death. Everyone rallied around Mark, offering their condolences, but the sympathy was a cold comfort. Mark couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him, consuming him from the inside. Every time someone mentioned Alexandra's name, it was as though a knife twisted deeper into his heart. He had been a willing participant in the destruction of the woman he had once loved, and now her memory haunted him relentlessly. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to maintain his calm facade, but he too was unraveling. The weight of the secret they shared began to show in subtle ways. He withdrew from his social circle, his once carefree demeanor replaced by a guarded and paranoid edge. He avoided anyone who might question what had really happened that night. The pressure mounted, and the fear of being discovered slowly eroded the bond that had once held him and Mark together. Mark's life quickly spiraled into chaos. He couldn't look his children in the eyes, knowing that he had taken their mother away from them. He tried to keep up appearances at work, but his mind was always elsewhere, filled with the memory of that horrific night. His colleagues noticed his strange behavior, but no one dared ask him about it, assuming it was grief that consumed him. But grief wasn't enough to explain the growing sense of paranoia that gripped him. Mark began to fear that people knew the truth. He imagined their whispers behind his back, the suspicious glances they threw his way. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone put the pieces together. And as the days turned into weeks, Mark's sanity began to unravel. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Alexandra's lifeless body, heard the sickening thud of her head hitting the floor. He relived that moment over and over again, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The guilt gnawed at him, unrelenting. He tried to drown it in alcohol, in long drives through the empty streets at night, but nothing could wash away the blood on his hands. The more he tried to run from it, the more it consumed him. He was haunted by the weight of the secret he shared with Daniel, and the knowledge that there was no escape. And Daniel, his once lover, now a constant reminder of what they had done, was always there, lurking in the background, keeping Mark tethered to the darkness. They rarely spoke after that night, their once passionate affair reduced to awkward silences and fleeting, guilt-ridden glances. But they were bound together, their fates intertwined by the crime they had committed. One evening, weeks after Alexandra's death, Mark sat alone in his house, the silence pressing in on him. His children were staying with his parents, and the house felt hollow, empty just like him. He stared at a bottle of whiskey on the table, the amber liquid swirling in the glass. He had tried everything to numb the pain, but nothing worked. The guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Daniel. "We need to talk, now." Mark's heart raced. He hadn't spoken to Daniel since the day of the funeral. He had tried to avoid him, to put distance between them, but Daniel was persistent, unwilling to let Mark drift too far. He knew what Daniel wanted to talk about: the secret, the guilt, the fear of being caught. He ignored the message at first, but the weight of their shared burden gnawed at him, pulling him toward Daniel once again. He couldn't avoid him forever. Reluctantly, Mark grabbed his keys and left the house, the cool night air doing little to clear the fog in his mind. He drove aimlessly for a while before finally heading to the meeting place, a secluded park on the outskirts of town where they had once met in secret, long before everything had gone wrong. Daniel was already there, pacing nervously by a bench under the dim streetlight. He looked thinner, more haggard than Mark remembered, as though the guilt had been eating away at him too. When Mark approached, Daniel looked up, his face tight with worry. "We can't keep living like this," Daniel said, his voice strained. "It's going to come out. People are asking questions and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Mark said nothing. He knew Daniel was right, but the truth was too unbearable to face. "We should have never done it," Daniel continued, his voice trembling. "We should have just. I don't know. I thought we could move on, but I can't. I can't live with this anymore." Mark's stomach twisted. He had been thinking the same thing for weeks, but hearing Daniel say it out loud made it all the more real. "I don't know what to do," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." Daniel looked at him, desperation in his eyes. "Maybe it's time we come clean. Maybe it's the only way to." "No," Mark cut him off, his voice sharp and panicked. "We can't. If we tell anyone, it's over. Everything's over." But it's already over," Daniel shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "We destroyed everything. There's nothing left to save." They stood there in silence, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like a heavy, suffocating fog. Mark knew Daniel was right. Their lives were already in ruins, haunted by the ghost of Alexandra and the blood they couldn't wash from their hands. In the end, it was too much for Mark to bear. The guilt, the fear, the endless nights of torment, it all came crashing down on him in a wave of despair. Without warning, Mark turned and walked away from Daniel, the gravity of his decision pulling him toward the inevitable. He couldn't face the truth. He couldn't live with what they had done, and he knew there was only one way to escape the darkness that had consumed him. The next morning, Mark Evans was found in his car, parked by a secluded lake just outside of town. A single bullet had ended his torment, leaving behind a note that confessed everything: the affair, the murder, the unbearable guilt that had driven him to this final, desperate act. The town was left reeling from the shocking revelation. The truth about Alexandra's death sent ripples of horror through the community as people grappled with the reality of the man they had once admired. Daniel was arrested shortly after Mark's death, the full extent of their dark secret finally coming to light. The trial was a media sensation, but the verdict was clear. Both men had been consumed by their own obsessions, and their lives had been destroyed by the choices they had made. In the end, Alexandra's death had been the catalyst that unraveled everything, a tragic end to a story of love, betrayal, and obsession that had spiraled out of control. The town would never forget the Evans family, forever marked by the dark secret that had torn them apart. And as for Daniel, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the memory of that night, imprisoned not only by the walls around him, but by the guilt that would never leave him.